But the biggest thanks of the evening goes to our co-hosts, the Lafayette 200 Bicentennial Planning Committee of Lancaster and Western Chester County. For almost 3 years, they've been planning a series of events to commemorate 200 years since Lafayette returned to America 50 years after the Revolutionary War, and it promises to be an exciting 3 days this summer. Lafayette is indeed coming. If you're like me, a lot of what you know about the Marquis de Lafayette comes from Hamilton. So you know that his story during the American Revolution is a good one. But this evening, you'll hear more about what Lafayette did after the Revolution, from his involvement in the French Revolution and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, to his return visit 50 years after the Revolution, a visit that took place as the firsthand memory of the American Revolution was fading, and Americans continued to ask what it means to be a democracy, where all men were declared free and equal, but millions were enslaved, and white men were the only ones who could vote. The story is a local one of Lafayette's visit to Lancaster County. It's also a global story of the relationship between America and France, between America and the rest of the world, and between America and global democracy. This history is being chronicled in the events happening this summer and also being explored at the forthcoming Stevenson Smith Center for History and Democracy that we at Lancaster History are all hard at work on. So it's also a story that is ongoing. These are relationships that are being redefined today and reminding us of the importance of history and understanding how we got to where we are today. Our speakers this evening, we have 4 speakers. First one will be Bruce Mowday, who is an award-winning author and newspaper reporter. He's authored more than 25 books on history, sports, business, and true crime, including Lafayette at Brandywine, The Making of an American Hero, and Lafayette, America's Young Hero and Guest. Dr. Louise Stevenson will be our second presenter. She's an emerita professor of history and American studies at Franklin and Marshall College. She specializes in the cultural and intellectual life of the 19th century United States in a transatlantic context. Ben Weber is a passionate advocate for local history research, education, and preservation. As a full-time civil engineer, his historical lens generally focuses on the environment and the impacts of our community's development. We're also thrilled to support his research and the Lafayette Bicentennial as a whole with one of our NEH fellowships for community projects. And our last speaker, Sarah Alberico, is a Lancaster County native, earning her BA in history from Millersville University and her MA in museum studies from Johns Hopkins University. She's been the curator at Historic Rockford for more than a decade, and we're thrilled to be supporting Rockford's latest exhibit on Lafayette, which will be coming this summer with loans from the Lancaster History Collection. So with that, I'll pass it off to Bruce and the panelists, and then we'll be back towards the end for a little bit of Q&A.
What a great group. Thank you all for coming out tonight. I love history and talking about Lafayette, but I'm going to rename my part of this panel discussion, and it's called Mission Impossible. I have 10 minutes to tell you about the history of Lafayette. And believe me, if we were going to do the whole Lafayette, we'd be here tomorrow at this time, and I could hand it off to Ben, but we're not going to do that. I'm a former newspaper reporter, and I was always told you don't bury the lead. So I'm going to give you the goal, my goal, I think everybody's goal, and certainly the Lafayette 200. And I couldn't say it better than my editor on my book on Lafayette at Brandywine. When she finished, she said, "You made me love Lafayette." And I think we all should in a very much different ways. He was responsible for a lot of our freedoms today. He was the one that really pushed the King of France to give us support to help defeat the British and win our independence. So when you're looking at the bottom line, he did so much. Of course, Frenchmen. His father died when he was 2 years old. He was killed in a battle against the English in the 7 Years' War. And you can imagine how that impacted young Lafayette. And Lafayette really wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. His mother spent a lot of time in Paris, and he was brought up by his aunt, and some nieces were a little bit older than he was. And this is a really important part of his life, because I think this is where a lot of the the knowledge came from and his sensitivity to everybody, because he was dedicated to freedom and independence for everybody, men, women, slaves, it didn't matter. And he carried this all the way through his life. And I think that's why, he's so much he should be respected. Even when he spent some years in a prison in Austria during the French Revolution. But I think this grounding right there in his young age really helped. Mother died a few years after that. Her family was pretty rich. Father's family was pretty rich. So that made Lafayette one of the richest people in France as a young teenager. His grandfather kind of took over his education and, more importantly, arranged the marriage to Adrienne. This was the era of arranged marriages where usually they were made for not love, but money and prestige and power. And it turned out this had every element, the love along with it. And you'll see a little bit later on when Adrienne really risked her life and died from joining Lafayette when he was in that Austrian prison and saved his life. So it was really a good match. Now, Adrienne's mother wasn't quite sure, so they didn't really tell Adrienne she was engaged for a couple of years after that, but it all kind of worked out. He was a musketeer, not one of the three musketeers, but a musketeer during the French, and he got to see the king every day. That was pretty good. Father-in-law thought, you ought to be a French officer, so he became a French officer very quickly, because back then you can pay for your rank. You didn't have to go in and prove yourself. So he was an officer, and it just so happened one of his postings, his commanding officer was a Mason and introduced Lafayette to a Mason. Very important for all of us, because when he got to America, who was here, Washington, Franklin, everybody were Masons, and that really helped him establish a lot of relationships. Now, in August of 1775, he was invited by his commanding officer to a special dinner. By that point, the 7 Years' War was over, and the English, it was unlikely or very uneasy allies with the French. Actually, the French didn't like them at all, but the English had won. And he was invited to this dinner, and the honored guest was the brother of the King of England. And during this dinner, the brother was saying, I don't believe these guys. Those colonists, they're over there. They don't want to listen to my brother. They're in armed uprising. And he's going on. And I can envision Lafayette sitting there, nodding his head and saying, yep, sounds good to me. And that's where I think really the spark. And Lafayette went out and he did some research. And he wouldn't approach Ben Franklin because the king said, do not come out in front for the Americans, because if you're a member of my court or associated with me, the English are going to just attack us again, and we can't hold them off. But that didn't deter young Lafayette. So at the age of 19, he decided he was going to come and help us. He gathered some of his other French officers, like-minded, and he started to come to America. The problem was the king found out about it, his father-in-law found out about it, and they set off the king's men to capture him and bring him back, and it was like an escape across France. And he did make it to Spain, but he had a problem. How will we get to America? And if you're the richest person in France, what do? You buy the ships, and that's what he did. He actually spent a lot of his fortune on us. And he was a volunteer, which was very, very important. So he got on that ship and he started over. And there was another officer by the name of DeKalb there who knew some English and had been in America before. So Lafayette studied English, and since he was given a commission to be a general in George Washington's army, he thought he ought to know a little bit about tactics. He had never been in a battle, and so he started reading battle tactic books. And the one thing else he did, which I like to cover in my book, he wrote back a letter to his wife. And in that letter he said, guess what? I left. He never told her he was leaving. So he left. It's true. And I love reading the old letters. and the old documents, but they can stop you the way they're written. And so I don't quote a lot directly out of them, but I quoted a lot out of this letter. And you can just see this 19-year-old kid going, whoops, what did I do? And like every other word was, you still love me, don't you? This is a great cause. You'll be proud of me. You love me. And it went on for like pages. But I think it really was an insight of this young 19-year-old as he came to America, that he was just so driven by this idea of equality and freedom for all. He does make it to South Carolina, buys different carriages to get his people up to Philadelphia. This usually takes me about 2 hours to do. So my watch went off. So somebody, Ben, will you throw something at me when my time's up? So he gets to Philadelphia, knocks on the halls of Congress, says, "Here I am. I have my commission." And what did our vaunted Congress say? Go home. We don't want you. George Washington earlier said he had enough of European officers. They took our money. They disrupted his command. They didn't speak English. They couldn't raise fund. Other officers and men, go home. That did not deter our 19-year-old. He wasn't going. And he went back a couple days and said, look, I came here. I defied my king. I left my family. I'm here as a volunteer. Let me in. Going back and forth. And Ben Franklin came and said, what are you guys doing? We need the support of France and other colonies or other nations. He's a volunteer and he's rich. We're poor. We don't have any money. He's going to spend it on us. Let him in. So eventually they went and they talked with Washington. I think they duped Washington a little bit. They said, just let him in, let him dress up as a general, sit him in the corner, and everything's fine. Well, that was not what Lafayette had in mind. When he met Washington, he said, where's my troops? I'm ready to fight. So he wasn't going to stand back. That he's on Washington's staff. You've read about or heard about the relationship that developed between Washington and Lafayette, father and son, and I think that really is pretty close. He named his only son George Washington Lafayette, and during the French Revolution sent him to stay with George Washington here, so it was really close. Let's skip ahead to September the 11th. Always a good date in our history, right? September the 11th, 1777, Battle of the Brandywine. Early in that morning, Lafayette was just another European officer on Washington's staff. Yes, the same staff with Hamilton. Everybody's seen Hamilton or heard of Hamilton or heard the music. Well, they were together at Brandywine. And in the morning there, the men didn't really know him. He had only been in the army for a couple of weeks. And, there was a lot of European officers in and out. He didn't have any command of the troops. And as the day went on, he's doing what staff officers do. His memoirs talk about being at Brandywine and behind the John Chadd House and just doing things. Then, when it looked like another big defeat for George Washington, and it was a major defeat, but it could have been a lot worse, Lafayette was surrounded and outflanked, and the British were up on the hill coming down on his back, and Washington's trying to get his troops aligned and swing around to stop them. And that's when Lafayette said, I want to go up and I want to help. Washington said yes. Lafayette went up with a couple of his French officers, found General Conway's troops. Remember, he's an officer, which means he could be the last person in the back of the room staying on his horse and telling me to go fight. But he didn't. He got off that horse, came down, got in front of the people, and put his life at risk to try to stem the tide. And while he was doing that, he was shot through the left leg. The moment his blood was spilled was the moment really when he started becoming the American hero. Because at that point, Washington, the troops, everybody knew he was serious. He spilled his blood, he put his life on line for the American freedom. And that was really when he started. You throwing anything at me? I'm at 11 minutes, but I just started. Enjoy Lafayette, everybody. Thank you.
Welcome, welcome. Let me get this down a little. They always build these for tall people, not me. This is on. May I have my first slide? Oh, I do it. Wait a minute. They showed me how to do this. Yes. All right. So here's Lafayette, and he might be arriving in Lancaster, right? I took this from a contemporary drawing. He's actually probably not arriving in Lancaster. And so what I did is I called it Lafayette's American Baggage, because he visited America 4 times. And each of those 4 times, he packed his bags with both things and ideas and took them home to France and tried to implement them. So I'm going to talk about economic affairs, social affairs, and political affairs. What I found out is the first time he goes home in 1779, he becomes the go-to guy. If you want to do business with France, if you want to have French tariffs removed, who do you talk to? Lafayette, because he can take you into the center of the French court. Furthermore, on Monday nights, he holds American dinners. His children, everybody there, spoke English because he had English guests, like Ben Franklin. I found evidently Ben went frequently to these dinners. And that helps in his networking. So in a sense, he's a very modern guy. And finally, you have all heard about his influence on the Declaration of Independence, right? All right, so we're going to talk about that just a little bit. The ideas of the Enlightenment, when Lafayette imbibed them as a young man in France, resonated with him immensely. And so these ideas found expression across Europe among the educated and also in the 13 colonies. So in 1775, he attends a meeting of Masons, as you point out, and lo and behold, whom does he meet there? Our friend Benjamin Franklin, who served in France from 1775 to 1785 about. And then he goes on, because Freemasonry, its core ideas, opposition to absolute government and belief in self-governments, overlapped with the American ideas in the Declaration of Independence. So you see this all going together. A year later, he reads the Declaration of Independence. It must have seemed that in the 13 colonies, his political hopes were becoming reality. On the other side of the Atlantic, here, the rubber seemed to be hitting the road. Not surprisingly, the ambitious young man drew on his many connections to arrange his enrollment in Washington's army. And among these connections was our friend Benjamin, whom he met in Paris. And there he is making his case, and Ben endorses it, and the Masons help him arrange for his trip to the United States. Now, what I want to do is I'm going to compare the Declaration of the Rights of Man, 2 articles, with the Declaration of Independence. And just in case I need reminding, here are the words. So let's go to Lafayette. Nature made men, let's emphasize that, free and equal. And what he means by that is you are born with human rights. They do not accrue to you because of your being in the nobility. So the Declaration of the Rights of Man says no nobility. That's his core idea. And then we're going to go on. And of course, you've seen the Declaration, the self-evident truths. What he does above is every man is born with inalienable rights. So that's every man. And so he is implying that that implies Black men and white men, and also the Native Americans in the United States, although I don't have time to talk about them. So now I have to move very fast to the French economic crisis of the late 1780s. In the early days of the Revolution, Lafayette rises to a position of leadership. By now, Jefferson has replaced Franklin as minister to France. He consults with Lafayette as Lafayette's drafted the document that became the Declaration of the Rights of Man. And that's a draft because it was revised by the National Assembly and adopted a month later. So, moving on, now I'm going to develop Lafayette's opposition to slavery and the slave trade. In 1783, Lafayette, having returned to his homeland after Yorktown, wrote Washington. He invited him to join a scheme to prove that enslaved people could be self-sufficient. Washington, in reply, praised Lafayette for his ambition, but said, "Sorry, I can't join you." The following year, Lafayette visits Mount Vernon for 2 weeks. This is their departure. And he hoped to emulate Washington as an estate owner and farmer. But unlike Washington, he's going to initiate a program in the French colony to demonstrate how gradual emancipation might work. So during tours of Washington's farms, he witnesses slavery in action, and he learns about Washington the farmer. Washington had many agricultural improvements, including selective breeding of his livestock, transitioning his crop from tobacco to wheat, and the invention of labor-saving devices. These inventions and Washington's engagement in agriculture are going to determine the last 30 years of Lafayette's life. Notice in this picture of the departure, and I think it's done about 1840, but the event occurred in 1784, that there are no enslaved people. Washington and his wife enslaved over 200 people at Mount Vernon, so they're not there. Now, moving forward again, because of 10 minutes, I gotta skip the revolution, his response to its violence, and his 5-year imprisonment in Austria, just a tad. So for the last 35 years of his life, he lives at this modest estate that his wife inherited called La Grange. This is a 14th century French castle with 700 or 1,000 acres. I couldn't get that definitive. There, Lafayette demonstrated his dedication to Republican ideals. He attempted to emulate Washington, known as the American Cincinnatus, the general who stepped away from political and military power to cultivate his land. Lafayette often said that he wanted to be the French Cincinnatus. So in his cabinet or study, he created a physical display of Republican beliefs. The shelves hold over 3,000 volumes of political philosophy, natural history, and American history. Also note the cameos. There they are. Ben's over here. This is Washington, and I can't identify that guy. The closest I could get was Jefferson, but I'm not sure. So another room displayed portraits of every president whom he knew, and he was friends with the first 8 presidents of the United States. He had a hugely important role and many, many contacts. Finally, let's turn to his commitment to emancipation. Oh, I skipped the things that he borrowed for the farm. I'm sorry. Swine, cattle, a terrapin turtle. And I went, why? Because when the troops were stationed in Maryland and Virginia and they ran out of supplies, they ate terrapin. And also they imported farm machinery. And that is the improved plow that they're all working on. And that is a threshing machine. Before the invention of these machines, you had to thresh by hand, whacking the wheat. Okay, now emancipation. Here is another image of Lafayette being greeted in New Orleans by enslaved people. And what we see here is that this happened during his 1824 tour. Congress, now we have to go back a couple of months, when he first comes over and he's in Congress, Congress grants him $200,000, and that's not inflation adjusted, and 23,000 acres of land in Northwest Florida. As thanks for his participation in the revolution and advocacy of the American cause. In Florida, he intended to develop a vineyard worked by free whites. Its success would demonstrate that slavery need not exist in the American South. What he wanted to do in Guyana, in 1785, the year after he visits Washington, he buys 3 estates with enslaved people on them. He intends to educate those people and treat them humanely, and then he would free them. And what he wants to show is there's no need for the slave trade. Unfortunately, the French Revolution intervenes and his imprisonment, and he can never free them. Finally, on his American trip, he brings Frances Wright along, who is an American, she's an English woman, but she hates slavery. And in the United States, she intends to establish a community at Neshoba, Tennessee, to do much what Lafayette wanted to do in his Guyana plantations. So I have raced through these 3 periods or 4 periods of Lafayette's life. Instead of seeing this as 4 different compartments, I want you to see them as united by one idea. And that idea was expressed in the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal, and a government depends on the consent of the governed. So we have to ask, what is independence for Lafayette? We have been brought up to think of him almost exclusively, sorry, Bruce, as a military hero. But what we need to do is he not only fought for national independence, but for the independence of individuals. Thank you. Oh, and I did mean men. Let's not make him into equality for everybody. And I'll tell you about that later. If you gave me a day or 2, I would tell you about enslavement and women. We're not having equality in the sense that we define it today. Thank you very much.
Do you all know the theme song from the TV show Mission Impossible? Diddly, 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 diddly. Okay, so we're trying up here, folks. We're definitely trying. So I am going to be focusing primarily on Lafayette's trip to Lancaster. What did he do here? What did he see? What happened? And one of the things that Bruce was trying to get to, and that Louise made a slight reference to, was the farewell tour. So I need to bridge that gap before we get to gap, if you will. Anybody? I am a dad. You're going to get a lot of them. So Lafayette, to pick up a little bit on what Bruce said, he got the French Navy to become involved in the Revolutionary War, which cut off Cornwallis at Yorktown, which ended the Revolutionary War. Duh. Okay, huge hero for the forming of the United States of America. I'm sorry, Emily, is this too loud? I'm not sure. Okay, she's good. All right. So he is honored to the degree of celebrity. So if you ever saw the State of the Union address and you see the inside of the House of Representatives, on the left side of the platform, you see this full life-size picture painting of George Washington. Who's on the other side? It's not John Adams. It's not Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin. It's Lafayette, full size. We wouldn't have this country had it not been for Lafayette, okay? Now, if you talk to anybody who's under 40, is there anybody under 40 in this room? Emily, okay, I'm taking a pass on you guys, all right. You talk to anybody under 40 and you say, hey, do you know who Lafayette was? You know, nothing. But if you look at the founding fathers, and somebody did a study, because there's a stat, you know, a statistic. Somebody did a study and they looked at all the names of all the founding fathers and all the places that have been named after those founding fathers. Who comes at position number 5? That's Lafayette. We've got Lafayette Street. We've got Lafayette Elementary School. We've got Lafayette Fire Department. We've got Lafayette Tower Park right here in the county. And we're doing some events there. All right, so let me get back to Lafayette, his celebrity. 1824, James Monroe is the president. He's having some trouble with civic pride and getting people going to be proud about our country, to even remember that there was a Revolutionary War. And he reaches out to the last surviving general of the Revolutionary War, Lafayette. And he reaches out to Congress. Congress says, yeah, we'll pay for that. And they send a boat over to get him to come here for 3 months. He ends up staying 13 months. He travels 6,000 miles. That's not by Amtrak. That's not by car. That's by carriage, horse, or walking. 13 months, 6,000 miles, visits every single of the 24 states at the time. He goes back home, and this is when he's 67 years old, okay? I don't know. Anybody here 67 or older? See the raise of hands. I'm only 64, so, you know. But so he has this phenomenal tour, and it really helps to inspire people to learn about history, to celebrate their heritage, to feel civic pride and pride in being American, which we all love to do. And 200 years later, there's a reenactor who's traveling around the country, step by step, visiting every single of those states, every single of those cities and locations in exactly the same date 200 years later. And for 3 days in July of this year, he's coming to Lancaster. So I want to tell you what Lafayette did, and I want you to grab one of those brochures, or if you haven't written down the website, go and visit Lafayette200pa.org. Sign up for everything. Okay, so this is incredible of what's gonna be happening. Okay, so Lafayette in Lancaster. Again, the tour, we have this incredible series of festivities that were being planned to welcome the nation's guest. That's literally what we called him back then, the nation's guest, for 13 months. We've got a variety of online and in-person presentations that we're doing, as well as looking forward to the arrival of Ben Goldman, this fellow right here, who's going to be following the footsteps here in Lancaster in July. All right, so 1825, he literally leaves Chester County on July the 27th and crosses the county line on the almost brand new Philadelphia to Lancaster Turnpike. Many of us think of it as Lincoln Highway or Route 30. That's the road that he took right there. He stops with 3 barouche carriages. I'll show you a picture of one of them in a moment. but these are super fancy carriages. He's traveling in 3 of them because he's got a posse. He's got an entourage going around. He's got swag that's being thrown at him wherever he goes. He stops at, weirdly, Mount Vernon Tavern. That's the first tavern inside the Lancaster County border on the turnpike. And then he's greeted there by a lot of military veterans. He's given a copy of the 1824 Joshua Scott map that was on display in the lobby. I'll be referring to that a little bit. Arrives at White Chimneys and was part of the Slaymaker family property holdings at the time, the sign of John Adams. That's the way they used to refer to taverns. A lot of people didn't read, so there's always the sign of this, the sign of that, and there was a little graphic image to indicate it. And this is one of the few timed minutes that we know, 10:30. He stopped in for refreshments. I don't know what's being served, but we're going to have tea on that day in July at White Chimneys. So here's this Joshua Scott map. Stunningly, 1824 it was made. He comes the next year, so we know exactly what it was on the ground at the time. Stops at White Chimneys. The other end is where it comes to the city of Lancaster. White Chimneys is, this is a picture from 1820. The landscape is somewhat different. Urban Outfitters didn't have a warehouse across the street at the time. So it was still very bucolic, but a lot more trees. You can see the turnpike right there in front of White Chimneys. That's an interior shot of White Chimneys, which is a phenomenal place. It's been a museum for many, many years, and the stewardship of the Slaymaker family. So this is where the tea is going to be. I'm not sure that he actually made it inside the house, but definitely at the tavern. And this is a picture of one of the Lafayette barouches. This is literally one of the 3 Lafayette barouches. It's at the Studebaker Museum in Indiana, if you wanted to go see that. So stunningly. I asked if we could, roll it here for, a couple of days, but they weren't interested. So pressing on. Oh, sorry, it's maybe have trouble with the border there, but he stops in Paradise. In the village of Paradise, there is Clark Mechanical has a big sign there, and right in front of it is this weird stone. That stone is where he stopped to get out of his carriage. It's right there. He stops to get out of his carriage and steps out and addresses a number of people there, and then continues on his way. Let's see. Yep, then makes his way by 3:40 to the military gathering at Groves Field. Groves Field ultimately is in East Lampeter Township. It's where Lafayette Tower Park is that I mentioned, and Lafayette Fire Department. And the Lancaster County Historical Society in 1934 erected a marker on that location. We were able to take some folks out there and find that marker. Has anybody ever seen that along the Lincoln? Actually, that's along Route 340. There it is today, next to Rosewood Terrace Apartments. And this is the area from 1940. That middle aerial image is from 1940. And then to the left of that is a contemporary image that you can see the Rosewood Terrace apartment complex. And we'll be having in Lafayette Tower Park a troop muster and parade. So come on out. That's a free event, open to the public, open air. Pray for good weather. And then at 5:30, he finally enters the city. Now, people are stoked to welcome Lafayette into the city, to see him, to be a part of history. And he takes this parade throughout the city until 7 o'clock. I found a newspaper clipping that showed the route that said, we're going to be from here to here and here to here. And there's an ordinance. The city passed an ordinance. Get your wagons out of the street, get your trash out of the street, and keep it clear and keep it clean until the parade is over. And you could, get hauled into court, I suppose. So I love maps, in case you haven't figured that out. but this route shows him coming in on East King Street, heading in a westerly direction. Unheard of today, right? Traffic is going that way. Well, guess what? They didn't have car traffic back then. Makes his way to Charlotte, makes his way up to the north, and then all the way down through the city. Now, in the middle square, do you see there's a little courthouse sort of symbol? That's where the Soldiers and Sailors Monument is today, right? Well, back then there was a courthouse there. There was literally a courthouse, and then it burned down, and then they built another one right there. So it's just amazing. And he had this huge tour. He spent the night at Slaymaker Hotel, the Pennsylvania Arms, which today is the Blazing Jay's sandwich shop. Sorry. But he had a couple of festival balls in the Masonic Hall, which is still there. You can still see it. It says, weirdly, Masonic Hall on the side of it. It's right next to the Heritage Center, the old City Hall on West King Street. So it's just all these amazing places that are still with us. I asked the city, hey, this parade route, how many of these buildings were back there in 1825? Any guesses? Some would say 34. You're absolutely right. 34 buildings are still in existence. And we're on our Facebook page, we're going to be promoting, historic preservation, understanding that these things have been around. They had to be curated, had to be cared for in order for them to last. So we want to show, what did Lafayette see when he was here? What are the things you can still see that are still among us? It's a really interesting lens, I think, to celebrate the historic preservation and for us to be able to understand what our community used to be like. He attends a ball in the Masonic Hall. Who was it who asked if we're going to have our thing? Yes, we asked, are we going to have any events up in the Masonic Hall? No, we can't. There's only one bathroom. So it's kind of limiting, but let me give you a peek on the inside of it. So there's the Masonic Hall with the Grice building off in the distance. That's the ceiling of the Masonic Hall. Isn't that amazing? And that the two ends of that hall, there's these almost magical decorations. It's just incredible. Now, if you got a golden ticket, if you were Charlie Bucket and you got a golden ticket to the invitation to the ball, it would have looked like this. Now, this is Mrs. Reynolds' invitation to the ball. Now, this doesn't last just because somebody found it in a kitchen junk drawer. This lasts because there are people like LancasterHistory and Historic Rockford who preserve these things, who curate them, keep after them, make sure they're well protected and cataloged and understood. And I'm going to turn over to Sarah because she's going to talk about the exhibit of all these artifacts that help us to understand our own history as well as these visits like Lafayette's. So, one last thing. Yeah. So, sorry. Lafayette, his second day, he visits clergy at the Lancasterian School. You've heard of that, right? Yeah, it's where the post office is on Chestnut Street. And meets with several clergy, goes and visits other citizens. He goes to another feast. And remember, this guy is 67 years old. How is this possible? I know I couldn't do all this. And he attends another ball in the Masonic Hall. One last shot I want to show you is this painting of that county courthouse in the center and this of town. This was done by Benjamin Latrobe in 1802. Again, these are images that don't just pop up on their own. They're cared for by others who look after them. So thank you to all the historical organizations that keep this history alive for us.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here. And I'm so excited to be collaborating with Lancaster History, and I'm here to talk about some special objects in our upcoming focus exhibit at Historic Rockford entitled 1825 Lafayette in Lancaster. As we just heard from Benton about Lafayette's journey through Lancaster County, can we pinpoint any surviving material culture associated with Lafayette's visit to Lancaster County in 1825? We can try. There are hundreds of objects in existence that relate to Lafayette's farewell tour through the nation, but I wanted to specifically highlight objects that have a provenance of existence during Lafayette's visit to Lancaster County in 1825. How is this possible? Finding the right primary and secondary sources can serve that purpose by providing evidence, whether directly firsthand, like diary entries, or written after the fact as secondary commentary and discussion of evidence. The most invaluable sources I was able to find for this research are the journal kept by Auguste Lavassieur, private secretary to General Lafayette during his trip, Lancaster Intelligencer newspaper articles from 1825, the Journal of Lancaster County's Historical Society, and oral histories. I've repeatedly come across oral histories as sources of provenance for objects, and I see it as holding some truth, but possibly some of these stories turn into a heard it through the grapevine situation, so perhaps we should always take such information with a grain of salt. That being said, here we have quite an interesting object, a walking stick with what appears to be a hand-carved wooden bust of Lafayette atop it. The slaymaker family of Lancaster, dating to the early 18th century at White Chimneys, still resides here in Lancaster today. They have been a wealth of knowledge, and the family has passed down artifacts from generation to generation. When Lafayette stopped at the White Chimneys estate on his way west into Lancaster City, Amos Slaymaker would have been about 70 years old, and his son, William Daniel Slaymaker, about 28 years old. There is no mention in Lavasseur's journal of this stop, but in the Lancaster Intelligencer article on August 2nd, 1825, Lafayette and his cavalry escort, quote, moved on to Slaymaker's Hotel in Salisbury. Here the general alighted, was introduced to the members of both troops and a number of citizens who had assembled to see the distinguished guest, and after partaking of some refreshment by Mr. William D. Slaymaker, he again ascended the barouche, end quote. We see an even shortened summary of this in the August 5th, 1825 Lancaster Intelligencer article. So, unable to find a written record of the provenance to this Lafayette walking stick, we turn to oral history passed down through the Slaymaker family for generations. Quoting from the late Samuel R. Slaymaker II's book, Captive's Mansion, from 1973, he writes about the history passed down to him regarding Lafayette's visit to White Chimneys estate in 1825. Quote, before leaving, the general presented Amos with a walking stick, capped and with a carved likeness of himself, end quote. Of course, there is much mystery surrounding this walking stick. An identical match has never been found, and so this is quite one of a kind. There have been many musings about it. Had it been commissioned for Amos to commemorate Lafayette's visit? The bust certainly bears a likeness to Lafayette's portrait shown here. There is always more research to be done, but for now, we continue on until new information is found. Heading west into the city, Lafayette and his procession then paraded through the town. Here we have an incredible primary resource, about 8 inches high and 9.75 inches wide. This ink drawing on paper depicts a giant decorated arch that would have been so large the horses and carriages could travel through. At the bottom of this drawing is written, an arch erected by the patriotic citizens of West King Street, Lancaster, in honor of the arrival of General G. M. Lafayette, who visited this town July 27, 1825, end quote. The Lancaster Intelligencer articles from July 29th, August 2nd, and August 5th, 1825, do a fabulous job describing these arches in detail. Note the mention of evergreens used in the East King Street arch, but we also see evergreens used on this West King Street arch drawing. Side note, today we often think of decorating with evergreens in winter and at Christmas time, but as you can see, they are being used here as decorations in July. On August 2nd, 1825, the newspaper article states that, quote, in each of the 4 streets from the courthouse was a neat and beautiful arch with appropriate descriptions, decorations, etc. At night, these arches, together with several of our houses, were brilliantly illuminated, end quote. So this tells us that there were at least 4 arches erected in the city. And if this drawing is meant to represent the arch on West King Street, is it possible that there are 3 other arch drawings that were made, showing us what the others looked like? Perhaps something will surface one day, but for now, let us marvel at this surviving illustrated record made by the citizens of Lancaster. My last bit of information to share regarding this object is the exact detailed description that the newspaper wrote about this specific arch on West King Street in their August 5th, 1825 article, quote, "The next object worthy of notice encountered by the procession was an arch beautifully decorated in West King Street, on the center of which was a fine transparency of Washington and Lafayette, and on the wings one of General Wayne, Benjamin Franklin, General Hand, and Montgomery. Underneath the center transparency was the following inscription: 'The Patriots of the Revolution, we delight to honor them.'" End quote. Progressing on our material culture timeline through the county, the next object of interest is a large hard-paste porcelain soup plate circa 1760, imported from China and donated to Lancaster History from the Slaymaker family of Lancaster. The oral history accompanying this plate was that it was used in entertaining Lafayette in Lancaster in 1825 at Slaymaker's Hotel in Lancaster City. Lavassieur wrote in his journal, quote, "Slept at Slaymaker's Hotel on King Street." And we see here from the Lancaster Intelligencer article that Mr. Slaymaker provided an excellent dinner on the evening that Lafayette arrived in town. I don't see how we could prove that this soup plate was actually used by Lafayette, but how interesting to hear the family provenance that came along with its donation to Lancaster History. Next, we have a punch bowl from the collection of the Phillips Museum of Art at F&M. This is an order of the Cincinnati Chinese exported enameled porcelain punch bowl circa 1790 to 1810. You see George Washington in the center there, surrounded by rings, each ring with the name of a state. The tie-in to Lafayette with this punch bowl stems from a January 7th, 1968 Lancaster Sunday News article describing a George Ross exhibit at the North Museum in Lancaster. This article mentions different items that were on display in that exhibit, including, quote, "a punch bowl commemorative of the Revolutionary War, believed to have been used by General Lafayette during a visit to Ross in Lancaster," end quote. If we then look at our continuously corresponding Lancaster Intelligencer articles from 1825, we see brief mentions of Lafayette's visit to his old friend George Ross. To clarify, this George Ross that Lafayette visited was the son of the George Ross that signed the Declaration of Independence, but he had died in 1779. At the time of Lafayette's visit, George Ross Jr., born in 1752, was 73 years old and confined to his house. Checking on Lavassieur's journal, he wrote, quote, "Visited George Ross, Esquire, son of the signer of the Declaration of Independence." As with the Slaymaker soup plate, I don't have a way to prove the Lafayette provenance on this punch bowl, but I could very well see George Ross offering a glass of punch to Lafayette during his visit and think that this punch bowl would be quite appropriate with its decoration. Finally, my last object to share with you is another fantastic primary resource. Before Lafayette's arrival in Lancaster, this was published in the Lancaster Intelligencer on July 26, 1825. Quote, "A party will be given to the ladies of Lancaster on Thursday evening next in the courthouse, which will be honored with the presence of the nation's guest." This would put that party at Thursday evening, July 28th, in the courthouse, which was in the center of the square, eventually torn down, and now where the Civil War monument is standing. Unfortunately, this Lafayette Ball invitation simply says Lancaster, July 1825, and there is no mention of which day or location in Lancaster. The names along the bottom of the invitation do correspond to all the names at the bottom of the newspaper article. I had originally thought that the invitation was unique to Lancaster, Pennsylvania, but stumbled upon an exact invitation for a Lafayette ball in Philadelphia in September 1824. I say invitation with quotes because perhaps, like the newspaper article states, quote, subscription papers are left with each of the managers. Subscribers may obtain tickets for the ladies, end quote. Maybe this is a ticket. I do not know. Lavassier did write in his journal on Wednesday 27th, quote, ball in the evening at Masonic Hall. Although we see that this quote from the Lancaster Intelligencer puts the ladies' party at the Masonic Hall on Thursday, July 28th, not Wednesday, July 27th, as Lavassier wrote. Lots of questions, but great object. In addition to all of the lovely pieces you just saw on the PowerPoint, we will also be displaying various pieces that were made to commemorate Lafayette's farewell tour as the nation's guest. Also notice this great Lancaster Intelligencer newspaper ad from July 22nd, 1825, advertising Lafayette badges for sale at reduced prices. I would love to come upon one of those. In conclusion, I would like to thank all of the lenders who contributed to this exhibit, making it possible. And so I hope you can all come and visit. Thank you.